Hi, everyone. So awesome to see you all again, except I can't see you because we're virtual on the internet. We definitely have been throwing a lot of content at you and had a lot of awesome speakers. I hope you're brushing up those resumes as we get ready for tomorrow's 8-hour watch party on the IGDA Foundation panel over at Shack News. But for this morning's release, I am really excited about this particular talk. We have Zachary Heineman. Am I saying that right, Zachary?
Heineman.
Zachary Heineman, the head of quantitative research at Activision Blizzard Media. Zachary looks over all things quant research for media business, focuses on product and user experience research, as well as audience research. Zachary also personally identifies as queer and has been gaming almost his entire life. And the focus of this project, titled Highlighting Underrepresented Gamer Voices, the focus of the project is to highlight voices that you don't often hear about in gaming, such as LGBT gamers and gamers of color. We obviously really care about representing all voices and making sure that everyone is welcome to play and make games. Zachary, as you and I have talked extensively about the Online Foundation, our 60 grantees this year were basically kind of, they are void of any sort of in-person experiences or job finding experiences as we continue to go through this whole global pandemic shindig. And it's totally changed the way that we have reconfigured our pipeline of getting all these different voices involved in games, and not just involved. We want them to be retained. We want people to stay in games. We want people to work for awesome people and not have to go through the trials and tribulations that you see, especially given recent events and the new conversations we're having on race, on gender, on sexuality, on just, workforce professionalism. So I'm really excited that we actually get to have a conversation about it today. And would love if you could take it away. If you could share a little bit about yourself, and maybe we could start this talk and we'll go into some of the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me. It's not often that I get to talk about something that is so important to me, being, a queer person who's been gaming since I was 4, who's identified as a gamer for so long, and who now works at a gaming company. It's really exciting for me to just have the opportunity to talk about it too. And I think that's a good kind of transition into the research that I wanted to share a little bit with everybody today. So I have been, a lifelong gamer, and I've also been, openly queer for almost 12 or 13 years now. And those are two things to me that have never personally felt antithetical. They actually felt very much so the opposite. I felt like, for me personally, gaming was an avenue where I was able to discover my queerness. I remember being a very effeminate young kid, and I would always pick the girl character. And that was my first sort of opportunity, being like 7 years old, not having the vocabulary or the vernacular, to say things like queer or gay. And, I felt myself gravitating towards, women in games and femininity. And so it's always been really special to me as a personal medium. And that was kind of a huge motivating part of this research. So my team at Activision Blizzard Media, we do a whole wide array of things, but one of the biggest things we're trying to do is kind of educate the industry, particularly the media industry, about gamers and about gaming identity. Because a lot of times you hear gamer, the phrase is thrown around, and particular images are sort of summoned and invoked in your head. And they're often very stereotypical, young, cis, heterosexual, white men tends to be sort of the dominant cognitive perception of gamers. And one of the things that we really wanted to disentangle and demystify was, who is a gamer, right? So who games, why do they game, when do they game, and what does that identity mean? And particularly, especially as we look at younger generation of gamers, particularly Gen Z and millennials, we're seeing that gaming is becoming, a much more diverse, a much more inclusive space than it historically ever has been. And I think a really important part of this research was sort of demystifying for some of our advertising clients and the ads industry in general, what is a gamer, who is a gamer, and they're not really necessarily who you think they are. So we're Activision Blizzard, and I work at Activision Blizzard Media, which is a part of the overall Activision Blizzard family. We make games like Candy Crush, Call of Duty, Overwatch, World of Warcraft, Hearthstone, and we really wanted to answer this question very broadly, and this is where the research sort of started. What does it mean to identify as a gamer? And I think identity is one of those nebulous things where it's very hard to define, it's very personal, and the idea of identifying as something is such an intrinsically embedded experience as people. We all have identities, things that we do, things that we identify with, but we really wanted to disentangle this idea. What does it mean to game, and what does it mean to identify as a gamer? And then how does that interact with the other identities and sort of sociological dimensions that we hold? So the methodology here, we did an at-home survey late in 2019 with our insights provider, Toluna, and we actually sent a very, very long, over 300 question survey to over 22,000 gamers worldwide. And we asked a lot of questions about their behaviors around gaming. So what franchises do you play? What genres do you play? How often do you play? But we were really interested in going a layer deeper. And we really wanted to kind of go into somewhat uncharted territory from a research perspective and disentangle that idea of, do you identify as a gamer? But also, what does gaming mean to you, right? What are your perceptions of gamers? What are your perceptions of games? How do you feel about representation in gaming? And what is the emotional, sociological, kind of more narrative-driven connection to gaming that you may or may not have? And what are some of those dimensions? Because I think a lot of the research out there focuses historically really on behaviors. When do you play, what do you play, and how do you play it? But we really wanted to go a layer deeper and think, what is the special emotional connection that gaming has to some people? And not necessarily everybody, which we'll kind of get into, but what is that sort of emotional connection? And so we wanted to flesh out this understanding of gamers with that deeper kind of lens. So right off the bat, we found that in our sample of 22,000 people, everybody played games. That was a prerequisite of being a part of our sample, but only 39% of our sample, so well under half, actually identified as a gamer, right? So everybody here is physically playing games, but not everybody's quite identifying. And that to us was such a foundational and interesting sort of layer and a thing that we really wanted to understand and kind of dig into. What does it mean to identify as anything, right? And when does something that is a behavior, candidly even a habitual behavior, when does it become an intrinsic part of your identity? So we kind of dug in a little bit first to understand who are these self-identified gamers. And we found some trends that weren't necessarily all that surprising, right? So we found that on average, they were 9 years younger than those who played games but didn't identify. We found that on average, with self-report data, they played 3 times more hours a week. And we found that about 31% of them said that gaming was their number one hobby versus only 5% of people who did not identify as gamers. And so some of these things, like I said, these are sort of well understood research trends. You play more, you're a little bit younger, you might be more likely to say, I'm a gamer, right? But then we sort of stumbled upon something that I think is very interesting and sort of got me personally excited as a queer person, but also as somebody who cares a lot about diversity and inclusion. And we found that self-identified gamers are 55% more likely to be LGBTQIA+, and 61% more likely to be a person of color. And this, right off the bat, I think was, for me personally, one of the most exciting stats from this entire research, because when you hear gamer and when you hear self-identified gamer, right? When you hear somebody say, I am a gamer, right? You don't think about that. You think, honestly, I would have thought candidly before this project, they'd be more likely to be cis and heterosexual. They'd be more likely to be white. And I was totally checking my own bias here and was completely wrong. And that was something that was really exciting to me. And it kind of made me think a lot about myself. And, you know, this is very anecdotal, obviously, because I'm referencing my own experience, but I have played games my whole life, and I've, for the most part, you know, excluding some periods where I was super busy, like in college where I didn't play that much, I've always identified as a gamer. You know, I was growing up, and for as long as I've been out, I've been saying I'm a gamer too. And so it was interesting and sort of gratifying to see that other people had, or rather the data sort of showed a similar experience. And then from here, you know, we went much deeper, and I won't go so far for the sake of brevity into all the things that we've learned. There's a tremendous amount of research we've done, and we'll be continuing to do on these audiences, but I wanted to highlight some of the most interesting kind of trends. So a lot of the trends that we saw for LGBTQIA+ gamers and gamers of color were very, very similar to one another. And we saw that actually a lot of the effects that we see are even amplified when we look at the intersection of race and sexuality. But honestly, common perceptions of gamers are cis, straight, white men and their gaming behavior. So we wanted to know, okay, what makes these gamers unique? So one of the first things that we found was that queer and gamers of color are younger. They're actually quite a bit younger, on average between 8 to 10 years younger than their cis heterosexual and white counterparts. But they've actually been playing games on average for the same number of years. And we looked at a variable that we created, which was, what age did you start gaming? And what we found overwhelmingly was that gamers of color and queer gamers started gaming a lot younger than their counterparts. And that kind of resonated a lot with me. And we found that a lot of the increased gamer identification is really being driven by the age that you started gaming. So one of the biggest factors in our data that, you know, predicts identifying as a gamer is how young you were when you started gaming, and how long gaming has been a part of your life. And we're finding that these, you know, these gamers of color and these queer gamers, they've started a lot younger. And that really resonates with me. You know, I started when I was 4, and I've identified as a gamer kind of the entire time. And so it was really special to me because it was kind of getting into this idea that as time goes on, we're seeing increasingly populations are becoming more diverse, both with regard to race, but also with regard to gender and sexuality. And gaming communities are no exception to that, right? Younger gamers are more likely to be queer, they're more likely to be people of color, and subsequently, they're also more likely to identify as a gamer, which was a really exciting finding. We also dug into their motivations to game and where they kind of differed. So the data I'm representing here is for LGBTQIA+ versus cis and heterosexual people. However, the trends are exactly the same for gamers of color when compared to white gamers. Just for the sake of kind of making the chart not too busy, I only put one table on. But what we find overwhelmingly is that there are some motivations in our data set that are pretty universal. And those are motivations around fun and mastery, right? Enjoying gaming, everybody said that was a motivation. Liking to have goals and accomplishments, everybody said that was a motivation. But the areas where the really large and significant differences popped out for these populations was around the emotional and social connection to gaming. So we found things like, I can identify with characters in video games is a much more significant driver of gaming for LGBTQIA+ gamers than their cis and heterosexual counterparts. Similarly, things like being emotionally moved by events, fantasy, expressing yourself, creativity. And what we kind of found overwhelmingly when we sort of clustered all of these motivations together was that people are finding gaming as a space for them to be themselves, for them to connect with themselves, and for them to sort of express themselves through fantasy, through creativity in a way that they might not be able to in other sort of spheres and other sort of walks of life. And this really resonated again personally with me, thinking back to, you know, being a little kid, playing Final Fantasy, you know, identifying heavily with the women characters. And at the time, I didn't have a vocabulary for what that meant. I didn't know anything. I mean, I was like 7 or 8. But I really found myself, and I found a lot of my own ability to express sort of through fantasy. And I think that was a really exciting and kind of powerful finding here, is that the biggest differences in motivation is that deep creative social expression. And similarly, we kind of see this for LGBTQIA gamers. Their motivations are really reflected in the genres that they play and the games that they play. They're 63% more likely to be interested in role-playing games. This is also inclusive of action role-playing games and MMORPGs, massive multiplayer online RPGs. They're 81% more likely to be interested in simulation games, and they're 40% more likely to be interested in Overwatch. And Overwatch is kind of a particularly special game that's been making sort of a lot of waves currently, because it is kind of really representing a much more inclusive and diverse cast of characters than we would historically see for a game of that type. And so we did some deeper analysis here, and I won't go too far into the math to bore you, although I would personally love to because I love math. But we looked at the relationship between gender and sexuality and the belief that LGBTQIA+ representation in gaming is positive. And we found, interestingly, that queer people believe that their representation in gaming is more positive, actually, than their cis and heterosexual counterparts. But a lot of that is mediated by what they play and why they play. So because they are motivated to play for fantasy, for creativity, and for expression, we found kind of overwhelmingly that they're more likely to play fantasy and simulation games, and particularly Blizzard games. So games like World of Warcraft, Hearthstone, Overwatch, Diablo, games where there's a lot of character customization, games like Overwatch where the characters have, a lot of representation in terms of race, in terms of sexuality, and in terms of gender. We found that a lot of that relationship was mediated by what they were playing and why they were playing it. And actually, Overwatch is kind of a great example. This tends to be one of the strongest driver in this relationship, because Overwatch is making kind of a lot of waves right now in a way that I found really exciting. And to be candid, was a big part of why I wanted to work at Activision Blizzard. At the time I had not played Overwatch, and I wasn't even that familiar with the game mechanics per se, but I was very familiar with the waves that it was making in the world. It's a game that has a tremendously rich backstory for every character. It has lore, and it's kind of overwhelmingly representative. There are plenty of characters who are not white. There are plenty of characters who are queer. There are plenty of characters who, break gender norms in their representation and in their appearance. And I think that it is one of a few games out there that's really kind of bending the boundaries here. And I think that's why it has sort of gotten such an exciting queer following. And we found that in our data set too. We found that, LGBTQIA+ people were 40% more likely to play Overwatch. And that was a really significant driver in their belief that the representation that they received in games was positive. So that's kind of the overall research. I know I went through it kind of fast. There's sort of a million more data points and slides, and I got really, it was very hard for me to keep this concise and keep it as one thing. Otherwise it was gonna be 100 slides and we'd be here for days.
Oh, no worries. If you wanna unshare your screen, let's get into some of that. I know, yes, it seemed quick, but at the same time, I think that is such an incredible overview, especially as we're constantly having these conversations as to what a gamer is, right? And that was one of the questions that, some of our grantees were wondering is what keeps people from identifying as a gamer? We see a lot of studies, you have women and moms, they do play games, because they either purchase video games or they're playing lots of mobile games. And we have gotten into this world where video games are not just, scuffling down to your local GameStop and buying the disc and the ROM. There's esports, there's so much. So, I mean, what is it that keeps people, that maybe don't fit certain stereotypes from identifying as a gamer, even if they are playing as much as they want to?
Yeah, I think, to be candid, this is a really hard question. And I say this, our team has been thinking about this and we're talking about it constantly as we work on and as we flesh out and as we discuss this project. This is the question we keep coming back to, and we keep asking it I swear in like every single meeting we have about this project, in some form or another, we're asking ourselves too. And in some senses, I don't have a conclusive answer, candidly, which I know is a bit unsatisfactory, but I think a lot of it does come down to, one, what gaming means to you, right? And so I think an example, like in addition to being a huge gamer, I am a huge TV consumer. I consume an absolutely abhorrent amount of television. And for me, that's a part of my identity, because it's not just something I spend a lot of time on. It's very important and very emotional to me, right? I get emotionally invested into TV shows. You know, I feel like I know the characters, and I'm sad when a show is over. Whereas I know a lot of people who, you know, casually watch, you know, Netflix, Hulu, you know, something like that, when they have an hour or two at night, you know, when they're about to go to bed. And I don't think they would necessarily identify as a TV watcher. So I think a part of it is how much time you spend with it, right? If it's only something you do 5 to 10 minutes, maybe every other day, it might not break into your identity. But I think the deeper part for me is that social and emotional connection to it, right? Is it something you do to pass the time, that you get enjoyment, that you're like, this is just one thing of many things I do, you know, to fill some of my time throughout the day? Or is it fundamentally creating an emotional connection? Are you connected to the characters, to the narrative? Does it really play a special place sort of in your life, sociologically and psychologically? And I think, and I'm not saying this definitively, because candidly, our whole team is still racking our brains around it, and the data is so rich and so hard to wrap your head around. But I think for me, that's it. And that's one of the reasons why I really have been excited about this project, more than other kind of gaming insights projects, because that there's something there. There's that deeper, really like meaningful emotional connection that I think is so important. And that I think is where it moves from being a passive hobby to just something that is intrinsically kind of woven into the fabric of your life. Like, could you replace it easily with another 15-minute activity per day that equally kind of alleviates boredom? And for me, I couldn't do that with gaming. It's so special to me that, like, I watch a ton of TV, I play a ton of games. I can't replace them for each other. Some days I'm having TV days, some days I'm having gaming days, and those are not the same days. And I could not play games on a TV day, and I can't, you know, watch TV on a gaming day. It's really, they play very different psychological spaces to me. And so I think that for me is a huge part of it, is, you know, what place does it play in your overall media consumption and entertainment consumption? And, you know, what kind of psychological response is it eliciting in you?
Yeah. Switching to some of the surprises that you mentioned in the data, especially, you know, what kinds of people are more likely to identify as a gamer. What trends in your data do you think people should be, or do you think more people should be paying attention to and talking about? What are the trends that we're not really?
So I think a lot of it is, in one sense, it's kind of what I've been talking about the whole time. It's that gaming is beyond a behavior. And I think a lot of the industry research, you know, has been very focused on what you play, why you play, or not why you play, rather what you play, when you play, how you play. You know, a lot of the really larger segmentations and reports, they're very clinical in some senses. It's very focused on just the behaviors. And I think the thing that this project is only scratching the surface on, candidly, like I don't even think we've gotten anywhere near the depth of the truth, is what is the deeper emotional connection, right? What is it beyond just the very summary kind of top line statistics of like consoles played, games played, hours played? You know, what is the deeper psychological, emotional connection, right? How does it affect your mood? How does it affect your brain? You know, neurologically, what does it do? How does it make you feel? How is it woven into your social identity? And so I think for me, that's a huge part that, you know, we're only even scratching the surface with this one project, but I would love for everybody in the industry to be thinking about and to be talking about, because I think gaming is, in some senses, it's not that nascent. You know, in theory, the first game has been around for a very long time, depending on how we define game. But I think the sort of, my manager loves to say this phrase all the time, the cultural zeitgeist that is gaming is relatively new. And the way in which it has become so massive, so kind of pervasive, and has sort of been woven into the fabric of society in such a multifaceted way, I think that's kind of new. So I would love for us as researchers, you know, at Activision Blizzard, but the whole industry to really push ourselves, you know, let's go a little bit beyond just, you know, what people physically play and how they play, and really why. And I think that also really will open the door to kind of uncovering a lot more richness in the gaming community, right? Because a lot of the statistics are, you know, focused towards major demographies. So cis and heterosexual white men, typically, usually young, but the gaming community has a lot more. And the thing that this project has taught me is that those underrepresented voices in gaming, they are actually more likely to have that emotional and special and social connection to it. And I think that that's something we need to pay attention to as an industry and as a society.
Yeah, and especially on that note, you know, Activision Blizzard Media is awesome that they're doing all this research. They have you, and it's very well resourced. You know, we always keep in mind that sometimes independent developers have limited resources. So what would you advise as, like, you know, what's the minimum research? What recommendations would you have for an indie developer that's trying to do research prior to developing a commercial game and releasing it, if they don't have all the tools at their disposal to make sure that they are building out an inclusive game and understanding their audience and the gamer community?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I completely agree. You know, I and Activision Blizzard are super fortunate for the resourcing and the investment that we have in it. And I think, candidly, you know, if I'm being honest, I don't think the onus is as much on the indie developers personally. I think it's on us. I think the big names, the ones with the resources, the ones that can fund, you know, an entire research team to be working on this, it's on us to be doing research on inclusive practices and publishing it, right? Because to your point, that research is expensive. It's hard, you know, getting quality researchers takes time, money, getting quality participants, surveys. It's a lot of difficulty and work and candidly money. And so I think as an overall gaming community, it's on the big players, right? You know, it's on us, you know, and the other companies like us. It's our personal responsibility. We're the ones with the resources. We're the ones with the research teams. We should be doing the research on accessibility, on inclusivity, and we should be publishing that work. And I think that's a big part of the project that we're doing here. And I'm really happy about is we're really fighting very hard to make sure that it does not, you know, live and die within the walls of Activision Blizzard. We want to get it out there as much as possible. Obviously, you know, in some sense to educate the media industry, because those are sort of our primary interactions and constituents as a media business, but also to really get it out there to the gaming community. You know, some of this research is also intended to really just explain to the world games and gamers in ways that they didn't think. So I think the biggest advice, obviously, that I would give to an indie developer is within your, you know, resource constraints, always hire a researcher. I mean, I'm very biased. I've been a researcher my whole career, but always hire a researcher. Even if you don't think you need one, you probably need multiple. And it's really on us. You know, it's on those with the market share and the power and the resources that we should be paving the way so that inclusive games are not something that only indie developers are doing. It's really something that everyone's doing. And I think that's the world I believe in personally. You know, I want a world where all of the big players think inclusivity is just table stakes in their game creation.
Yeah, and research is critical. Research is critical when it comes to the contribution of knowledge, not just to whatever project you're working on, but to communities, to inclusivity. That's how we learn. We learn from people, we learn from data. What are some of the ways that your more quantitative approach and quantitative research on gamer identity has actually impacted development projects under your Activision Blizzard umbrella? I know you spoke a lot about Overwatch, but has your work, you know, made ripples or effects elsewhere, or any other contributions as well?
Yeah, so my work directly and my team's work, candidly, not anything yet. This is fairly nascent work. You know, if I'm being honest, you're kind of getting it right off the press. I was still analyzing and crunching some numbers like last week on this. However, there is a huge push within Activision Blizzard, particularly within Blizzard's user research team, that they're very serious about inclusivity and particularly accessibility. A really huge topic of discussion in gaming is not just including you know, characters of certain gender, sexuality, and race, but also ensuring that gaming is accessible to those with disabilities. So a huge initiative right now within Blizzard that I haven't really worked on directly, but I've sort of tangentially worked around and have had a lot of admiration for, candidly, is tons of user research on what are the ways in which we can make sure that the game is inclusive when it comes to sight, when it comes to sound, right? How can those who are vision impaired or audio impaired still enjoy the game and kind of get those experiences out of it just like anybody else? And I think that's also a tremendous kind of dimension here that we didn't address candidly in this particular research, but I think is equally as important and is something to really be thinking about in gaming, particularly as a very audio and visual medium. How is it accessible to those who may have impairments in those domains? So the short answer is, unfortunately, not yet has my work or our team's work sort of influenced any of that. I sincerely hope that it does and that we continue to do this work bigger and better, and we can lobby it around the gaming industry and around Activision Blizzard to really help show why this is so important in the development. But that does not mean that those efforts and that research is not being conducted already, honestly, by some of the biggest players, you know, in the gaming space, but, you know, within our own walls as well.
Given that your research is hot off the press, I'd love to dig in a little bit into the methodology behind this, if that's okay. Especially like when you're doing your research and analysis, are you observing, or are you also interacting with the audience on some level?
Yeah, so this overall project is pretty huge. There's actually this is only kind of one of many slices that we're doing of it. So typically speaking, as you might imagine, I lean heavily quantitative. I'm a quantitative researcher, and I've been doing like data science and analytics for the last 7 years. But I, as much as I love, you know, taking big data sets of behavior and big data sets of survey responses, right? And, you know, this one, for example, 22,000 respondents is pretty large for a consumer insights survey. And as much as I love, you know, doing statistical modeling, mediation, hierarchical linear modeling, clustering, p-values, like that's, you know, my jam and the stuff that we like to do, I firmly believe that no matter what, anything that you're trying to do quantitatively, by definition, is somewhat reductive. And that's sort of the point, right? You're trying to take such a rich, large data set of people who are so fundamentally complicated and really difficult to understand, and you're trying to reduce them to trends and numbers and values, right? And I think that there's obviously a tremendous amount of value in that. I mean, that's why it's my career, but I think that all really well done research and all really impactful research always needs to also have deeply qualitative components to them. So in addition to running a survey of 22,000 people, you need to be interviewing people. You need to be doing ethnographies. You need to include even just something like an open-ended question and pulling out themes. And that's something that we did with this project as well, and are continuing to do. So in addition to doing the larger sort of quantitative portion of these, you know, 22,000 gamers, we also then did on-street interviews with people who who play games, and we asked them questions. We took their pictures. We got a whole bunch of things about them and how they play, and then some of them, you know, with their approval, we then actually did an in-home interview with them, a complete in-depth interview, you know, well over an hour per participant. And it really got into the deep, the rich part of it. And, you know, it gave us insights that a survey can never give you, right? Because the best written survey in the world that is 1 million questions will always miss something, because people are complex and they will always, always surprise you, which is one of my favorite things being a behavioral science researcher, is that they'll always surprise you with something that you could never think of. Because, you know, as researchers, you know, as much as we try to be objective, we're people too. We have biases, we have ideas, and models are always going to try and reduce people that are so rich in their tapestry. So some of these in-depth interviews were really exciting because they gave us so much extra context, they gave us so much extra flavor, and they actually kind of added a lot of dimension. So one of the people that we interviewed was an openly trans woman, and she talked a lot about gaming and gaming identity and what it meant to her. And so much of what she was saying was right in line with what we saw in the trends and the survey data, right? And so we saw all these trends, and we were still missing a little bit of the why, and a little bit of the, you know, the deeper sort of richness, besides, you know, what we ourselves could provide, because you know, some of us, inclusive of myself and the team, are queer. And she added that extra dimension by saying all of the things that we were like, is it this, is it this? And so I think in my mind, methodologically, the best research projects, particularly around things like inclusivity, should always be mixed methods. You know, you should always be trying to get larger data sets to pull trends and statistical significance and models. And you should always be doing sort of qualitative stuff to gather that richness, that breadth, that depth, so that you're kind of going wide and going deep at the same time, because the best decisions come from a really multifaceted kind of approach to information.
I can't even imagine coding all of those interviews and grouping them.
We split it up as a team, and it was like 1 week, all of our job was to like pick a person, and you had to just watch and type all the meaningful quotes, write up all the games that they mentioned. Yeah, it was a long week.
I can't even imagine.
To be fair, I'm not personally much of a qualitative researcher, and I'm more of a quant. It is really fun though, because, you know, for my job, I got to sit there and just watch an hour and a half of somebody in their living room talk about how much they love gaming. And I was like, yeah, I have to like pause it every 10 seconds to write what game they wrote in, but like, there are definitely worse fates in the world.
Yeah. And, you know, we have had so many speakers, and we have so many more coming, but you have such a unique job. And that's something that we don't really know in video games, is that, you know, being a video game designer or a programmer or producer, that's actually just like, those are one of many, many, many roles that are open for hire. How did you get your gig in gaming? And like, I mean, are there a lot of researcher jobs there? I know we have grantees in our mix that are PhDs or looking to grad school. How did you get your start in games? Does your job exist, or did you just get one of like 10 positions available? And what does it look like? Because I had no idea.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I have a bit of a meandering back and forth sort of path in terms of my career. The one thing that's always driven me is that I like two things. I like people and I like numbers. So in undergrad, I studied psychology and statistics. Those are two things I like, people and numbers. And from there, I started off actually in academia. I was a full-time academic researcher in psychology and business for 4 years. And I did a whole wide array of things. You know, I did a study on romantic couples. I did a study on empathy and yawning. That was an interesting one. And then I sort of fell into a body of research on social identity. So I did a lot of research on what does it mean to present queer. I did some research on how people of the same race and gender, their sort of patterns of becoming friends and staying friends. We did a lot of stuff on stereotyping, and I eventually sort of wanted to make a transition, at least temporarily, kind of out of academia. And so I was sort of just interested in people, and I was interested in how people interact with each other. And that's sort of really the only MO I've had career-wise for a very long time, is how do I study people doing interesting things with math, right? And that's sort of been my kind of MO and my North Star. And So after leaving sort of academia, I worked at Twitter. I was a researcher for the ads research team, and I also did some research for the consumer research team as well at Twitter. So it was, how are people responding to advertising on the platform? We also did audience insights. Who are Twitter users? Why are they influential? And then, some stuff on consumer research. So why do you use Twitter? How to use Twitter? And so I had an awesome time working there, still very, very close with a lot of my colleagues there. And eventually I was thinking, social is very interesting, and I love, Twitter is one of my favorite socials. It is my favorite social, actually, and I've been a super user well before I worked there, since I was like 14. And one of the things that's always been really special to me is gaming. It has been something that was so special to me growing up, as I've mentioned, but I fell out of it actually when I got to college. And for no other reason than, when I was in college, I was working a million jobs because my family doesn't have a ton of money. So I had to work a lot to kind of keep myself afloat. And then, I was studying really, really hard because I wanted to do well in school. And gaming ended up kind of falling to the wayside, unfortunately. And after I finished my master's, I rewarded myself with a PlayStation 4. I bought myself a PlayStation 4. I bought the newest game of like my favorite ever game series. And I just went completely ham. I played it nonstop for like a week and a half, beat it the entire time. And so I wanted to kind of move a little bit out of social. I love social. I think it's really interesting and a very exciting space, but the opportunity kind of presented itself of a similar type role, because we are the media division and we work in media, but within the gaming space. And I was sort of like, this is a really exciting and interesting opportunity. I get to do some of the same stuff because I have been working in media and ads. And so it's a lot of the same type of research about, how do people feel about advertising? But then it was also a lot of allure of audience insights and consumer insights about gaming, right? And so similar to what kind of lured me to Twitter, I was like, yeah, I would love to do research on why people use Twitter. I'm a huge Twitter user. It was a similar type of thing here, right? It's, I want to get back into gaming. I fell out of it because I was so busy. I miss it a lot. This would be a great opportunity. And also gaming is so special to me. I've evangelized it to so many people throughout my entire life. And so the opportunity presented itself, and I was like, you know what, this seems like a really cool and exciting role. So I kind of just a little bit semi on a whim was just like, you know what, I'm going to do it. And I took a leap of faith, and 2 years later, here I am, honestly living the dream. And in terms of I guess the question was also kind of, do these jobs exist? The answer is a pretty resounding yes. We're the research team within Activision Blizzard Media, but across the entire Activision Blizzard King portfolio, there are tons and tons of researchers. Consumer insights, audience insights, market research, user research, user experience research, product research. There's a tremendous amount of researchers out there. And honestly, a lot of game companies have that, even from indie game companies all the way to some of the biggest game companies. Like, research is becoming increasingly a huge, huge part of understanding and kind of developing games. And I actually think research is becoming a huge part of really all industries, even within, social, for example, the proliferation of researchers that are being hired at your Twitters, your Googles, your Facebook. It's more and more every single day. And it's same within gaming too, right? I think there's a large scale recognition that, there is a need to understand the audience, to understand the value, and also to understand how people are responding to and reacting to and understanding your game. And I think that there's a recognition, kind of broadly speaking, that, games are very much so an artistic endeavor, but they also are intended to make an audience happy, right? So as much as they are born out of, the developers and the artists and the creative folks within the game studios' ideas, they're also intended at the end of the day to really bring joy and to bring happiness and to bring excitement to the players. And so there's, I think, a broad-based recognition more and more every day that we need to be reaching out to players. We need to be talking to players. We need to make strategic decisions about the art with also kind of the player as a part of the ride. And I think researchers are a really critical role of ensuring that you're not just making it, forgetting at the end of the day that your player is a human being, right? That's a person that is going to spend hours upon hours upon hours with your product. And it could be embedded, you know, as we talked about earlier, into the overall fabric of their life. So it's important to reach out to them and know who they are and what they like too. Oh, I cannot hear you.
I am muted. I was muted out of respect because I never wanted like the rustling of a pan or a chip to like get in. I'm sorry. And what I was saying was just that you've hit on so many things and so many beautiful components. We work with a lot of, you know, PhD and grad students where research is kind of a thankless job. People don't really know how much goes into these reports and what we put out, or IGDA's developer satisfaction survey, you know, which isn't even close. I want to kind of touch base because Zachary, you're also such an interesting person, right? Like,
oh my
normally,
God,
no, but normally what I would normally I would ask something like, you know, what does a work day look like for a data scientist? But I don't even know how to ask that because, you know, you're working from home now. You're not in your office. You're how, you know, like I'm assuming you're not doing IRBs or, you know, review boards or something, but how are you going to do your research or, you know, your mixed methods in a global pandemic?
Yeah, so actually this is, I think this is something that, you know, the entire research community in the world is really grappling with right now. And I have a lot of friends who are professors, PhD students, full-time researchers, and I talk very actively with them, and they're sort of grappling with this too. And I think part of it, candidly, is sort of solved by the fact that a lot of research has kind of moved digital already. So what I mean by that is like large scale survey research, which is, you know, as a quantitative research who focuses on behavioral science is a bit of my bread and butter. That's actually always been kind of digital for the most part. I mean, not always, but as of recent times. So for example, that survey we ran of, you know, 22,000 people, it was a completely digital at-home survey. And we actually ran it last December, you know, it was when December and January was when we collected the data. So that was, you know, something that we would be able to totally do again. And a lot of the research I do is reaching out to consumers directly through surveys, whether it be email surveys, in-game surveys. You know, we'll serve a survey saying, hey, you know, would you like to answer a few questions? Working with a vendor who can actually has a panel that they can sort of reach out to and kind of compensate. So the good news is that a lot of the quantitative research is kind of left for the most part unchanged. Where I think things get very, very complicated is when we move into the more advanced methodologies and when we move into things like qualitative research. The good news here is that I think, like the rest of the world, I think it's a bigger problem, or rather, it's not quite as insurmountable as we might have thought it to be. And so what I mean by that is that kind of going into the pandemic, there were a lot of things that, you know, we were like, I don't think we would be able to make this digital. I don't think we could possibly do this, you know, in a digital sense. And then I think people realized that if you put in some resource, some efforts, and some elbow grease, there's probably a pretty good way to do most things digital. And, you know, not everything, of course, but there's actually a lot more ability with a little bit of ingenuity and resourcing to turn certain things digital, right? I think a lot of my friends who are professors, for example, were immediately dismayed about the idea of online classes. And then they realize, you know, it's a tremendous amount of work, and I give such commendation to professors doing it. But with some effort and with some resources and from assistance from the university, they're actually able to really make successful, engaging, exciting classes in a completely digital sense. And I think research is kind of no exception here, right? I think a lot of qualitative research, they were like, well, how can we do IDIs? And then you sort of realize that, you know, a lot of times in IDI, yes, your in-depth interview, you're entering the person's home and you're recording them and you're interviewing them, but is there something so fundamentally different just about doing that over a call? Like even right now, you know, in an alternate universe, you and I would physically be in person having this conversation, but do we really feel like the quality of the conversation has actually been tarnished at all by us being over Zoom? And to be candid, you know, I'm in a different country even. And so I think that's the same thing with research. You know, there is a lot of work that needs to happen to turn things digital. There is a tremendous amount of effort, resources, it's time, it's money, and it takes a lot of thought. But I don't think it's an insurmountable challenge. And actually, one of the things I will say is that I think it's kind of causing a lot of people to rethink methodology and rethink research in a way that I think will actually in the long term be really exciting. So, you know, there's some vendors right now that do like neurological research with like GSR, galvanic skin response, and they would have somebody come in and they would attach them. But they realize that, you know, GSR can be captured at home. People can put on GSR like on a webcam and they're shown how to put it on, and you can already tell electronically if they put it on correctly from the signals. And they realize that they can just mail people GSR kits. And so some vendors are saying like, yeah, maybe it'd be a little bit easier if you came in person, but actually, you know, with a little bit more money and some thought and some effort about the process, we can get GSR at home, right? And I think it's an exciting thing in some senses because I think a lot of research, and I say this having come from academia, which was all lab studies with participants. You had to physically have them come into the lab and like have them, you know, do a task. I think it's causing us to challenge ourselves a little bit. And what I sort of sincerely hope as a researcher is that, you know, when this is over moving forward, we'll rethink the way that we think research, right? Like, do we have to have people come into a lab? You know, and there are going to be some paradigms and methodologies where we really, really do, but most of them we probably don't. And that actually opens up a tremendous horizon, right? We're not limited by convenient samples. We're not limited by people's physical proximity. We're also then kind of opening up our horizons to, hey, we're able to do research around the world. Hey, we're able to do research, for example, for those with accessibility issues. One of the big issues in a lab that I had worked in a while back was that it was actually not particularly accessible for those in wheelchairs. So actually all of our research by definition was kind of biasing against those with any sort of kind of mobility impairment. And that in and of itself is not inclusive research. So I think that there's an insurmountable kind of not a non-insurmountable challenge here as researchers, but I think it's very exciting that we have an opportunity to challenge ourselves and rethink research.
Oh, that's awesome. Zachary, thank you so much for your time today. I have a closing question, a personal question. I think that came in from one of our grantees was, what is your favorite queer themed game and why?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah,
so
that's the curveball we waited for the end.
Truly a curveball, you know, and I'm probably going to give a not super satisfying answer. I haven't played a tremendous amount of queer themed games, and you know, saying this out loud, it's a little bit embarrassing now that I'm talking about this, but I pretty much historically only play one genre. JRPGs is like die hard, bread and butter, pretty much 100% of what I play. And I'm sure there are queer themed JRPGs that I am fully unaware of, but I haven't played a queer themed one. I've played many where there are queer characters, however, and I've played many where they start to delve into queer stories. But I actually think that that is still within the JRPG space. It's a fairly nascent thing. You know, I think even, you know, in the incorporation of queer characters in that genre is still fairly new, at least in my experience, having played them my whole life. I think some of the first ones where I saw queer characters was, you know, 4, 5, 6 years ago, really. So what I will say, unfortunately, is that I don't have one. And if anybody listening to this has suggestions, please send me all of your recommendations because I will absolutely play them.
That's awesome. And we'll drop your LinkedIn and Twitter into Discord once this is up. Thanks again for your time. Thank you for your honesty and candidness. I think this summer we're a little, and summer for us, for other folks around the world, it is not summer. But we are definitely a little spoiled in that we've been getting to talk with a lot of awesome, diverse speakers and individuals from various companies around the world. And I don't know what life's going to be like when we have to go back to big conferences and realize that we're actually not that well represented as a community. But for now, I think I'm going to continue to enjoy having awesome folks like yourself and Zachary, in all sincereness, and especially to Activision Blizzard King for being a part and a sponsor of this program. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It is a real possibility that without your support, the IGDA Foundation may not have existed next year. And the love and support that came in for our 60 diverse grantees currently stuck in isolation with no networking opportunities, except with the exception of this and other virtual conferences. It's really been a treat.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I can't thank you enough. Like I said, I love talking about this stuff. It's very exciting. It's very, very near and dear to my heart. So, any opportunity to talk about gaming and diversity and inclusion, I'll chomp at the bit. So really thank you so much for having me. And what I'll say to anybody listening, and she will share out my contact information via Twitter and LinkedIn, please feel free to send me a message. I'm fairly responsive on both platforms. Feel free to reach out to me, say hi, any questions that you might have. I'm always available.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.